Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison. I want to welcome you to this session of Humanity Rising. As we begin today, I want to just continue our bearing witness on what's going on in Gaza. There's been some very interesting developments in the last 24 hours. You will remember that 2 days ago, the Israelis firebombed the Al-Mazawa refugee camp just outside of Rafah, where tens of thousands of Palestinians were fleeing by Israeli force out of Rafah into what the Israelis told them was a safe zone. And there they were firebombed, and upwards of 60 people were burnt alive, including a pregnant woman, and most of them were children. Huddling in tents, and then another several hundred people were wounded in one way or another. There were no hospitals to take them to, so you can just imagine the agony of those people. The Israelis first said it was a tragic mistake, then they denied that they did anything, and that it must have been Hamas or some explosions in a nearby fuel depot. And then this morning, the New York Times announced that the evidence is that the bombs used by the Israelis in the Al-Mazawa refugee camp were made in USA. So that concludes the matter of who did it. And what's important to take in, everyone, is that in the subsequent 48 hours, the Israelis have launched airstrikes against the Al-Masawa refugee camp, killing scores more. The last count from the attack earlier today is that 37 more, mostly women and children, have been killed. And also today, the White House announced through the National Security Council that no problem here. Israel has not crossed any red lines, and they're fully authorized to proceed in the way that they need to defeat completely the Hamas terrorists. All the hospitals now in Gaza have been effectively terminated and put out of service, including most recently a hospital in Rafah that's exclusively used for children. That is no longer functional. Israeli troops are now in the center of Rafah. And what we're now watching live on TV is the final assault by the Israelis and the US governments as they complete the genocide of Palestine in Gaza. I want to make one fundamental point and set some context for what we're seeing, both by way of enabling us to understand what's going on, but also by way of introducing the speaker, who I'll introduce in a few minutes. The most fundamental thing to understand here is that this is not happening by accident. This is happening by design. And I want to unpack that because I think it's essential to understand what's happening in Ukraine, in the Middle East, and as we'll discuss, in China. To know that this is part of a strategy that is being conducted by the United States and has been over the last 30 years and is reaching a crescendo and an outcome that the US did not expect and is having to deal with in a very highly ironical and paradoxical way. I've talked about this before. I want to summarize what we've discussed, but it's very important in understanding the history, context, and possible next steps in this miasm of escalatory violence that's being conducted by the United States against Russia, with Israel in the Middle East, and the escalating tensions in China. It started with the defense memorandum, the defense guidance document, as it was called, that was written by the Undersecretary of Defense, Paul Wolfowitz, and his assistant, Scooter Libby, in partnership with Richard Pearl, a defense analyst, and under the aegis of who was then vice president under George Bush Jr., Dick Cheney. It was leaked to the New York Times on March 7th, 1992, in which it stated clearly in writing that in the aftermath of the fall of the Soviet Union in December of 1991, so this was only within 90 days of the collapse of the Soviet Union, the US Pentagon and the key official in the White House came into agreement that the United States now had an unprecedented historical opportunity to establish what they called full spectrum dominance over the entire world. The first priority was to ensure that Russia did not rearm and not establish itself as a new superpower. The second priority was to understand that China was an equally potentiated enemy and needed to be controlled and subdued. Israel in the Middle East was the principal ally, as the Israel-US alliance needed to establish dominance in the Middle East by any means, and that the United States would take any measures anywhere in the world at its discretion to ensure global military, economic, and political dominance over planet Earth, including establishing an array of killer satellites in space. NATO began to expand eastward. Wars were fought in the Middle East, in Iraq and Afghanistan and Libya and Syria. Conflict was maintained and pressure was maintained on China until 30 years after the overtures of Gorbachev and the ending of the Cold War and the possibility of a peace dividend. We see the world at a point of danger as the policies of the neocons in the United States, wrapped around the rising military industrial complex and war machine that has subsumed the US government and political class and economy, is now escalating tensions in Europe, in the Middle East, and in China, with one very important difference. And that is, while 30 years ago, in the US contest with the Soviet Union and China, it was not an equal contest. The United States had technical, military, economic superiority in a significant way over the Soviet Union and in China. And there was a general feeling around the world that so-called American democracy and free market capitalism was really a better way to conduct affairs. Today, as the US maintains its escalation without any red lines in its escalating conflicts, the situation has now reversed itself. Russia is rebuilt. China is indisputably the economic superpower in the world. Both China and Russia, and increasingly India, South Africa, Saudi Arabia, Brazil, the BRICS countries are not only technically and economically and scientifically every bit the peer of the Western powers, and in many cases have superseded them, but the ideological struggle has definitively gone against the United States. The United States is no longer the light on top of the hill. Capitalism is no longer the wave of the future. Statescraft, real diplomacy, is now emanating out of Beijing, probably more than any other place in the world. And now there is a substantial global majority arrayed against the United States and the G7 as Israel, which are increasingly isolated against a growing majority led by China and Russia and the BRICS countries, India, Brazil, South Africa, Iran. In the face of this transformation, the only thing that the United States can think to do is to escalate the tensions. And that's what makes the world today so dangerous. We've talked a lot about Ukraine, talked a lot about the Middle East. We've had sessions on China. And I'm delighted now to introduce someone that I've gotten to know just because of the brilliance of his analysis and his intellect, who probably knows more about the Asian affairs in China and the geostrategic balances globally than almost anyone that I've encountered lately. And that's KJ No, who has been on the program once before, but I've sought down and asked to be a contributor today and a regular contributor so that we can understand the global frame of what's happening, and in KJ's case, with particular emphasis on Asia and the escalating tensions with China. So KJ, I want to welcome you to Humanity Rising, and I would invite you to say a little bit more about your own background. He's an analyst and a commentator who spends his time really immersed in the study of history and contemporary affairs. He works very closely with Code Pink, and in particular, their project on China is Not Our Enemy. So KJ, just tell us a little bit more about yourself, your interest in China, and how you would understand the current tensions that are developing between the United States and China in the Pacific.
Yeah, thank you, Jim. It's an honor to be with you and with Humanity Rising. And I'm delighted to be able to share a little bit of what I know. My background is largely as a journalist, analyst, scholar, and educator, in particular around the geopolitics of the Asia Pacific. And my specific interest in China is, it relates to my deep concerns about what is happening in the world. I've been following what was called the pivot to Asia for over a decade. I've probably reported on it more intensely than almost any other journalist that I know. And what I see is this continual and steady but inexorable escalation to war. And that makes me very, very worried. And I feel that it's very important for those of us with a conscience to do everything that we can to educate, but also to take action to prevent this, what looks to me, very imminent war. I think it really, humanity itself is at stake. So that's my core mission, if you will. And then once again, coming back to my background, many people have said that, I'm Chinese and what I say should be discounted. I'm not. I'm Korean. I'm South Korean. I grew up in South Korea. I served in the military. I have a little bit of understanding of what militaries do and what war looks like. And that just makes my motivation even stronger.
Mm. Well, why don't we start with your expertise on this pivot to Asia by the United States, which really got underway in the Obama administration. Why don't you just track that pivot and lead us up to the present time, and take all the time you need to just lay it out for our audience, what's been happening over the last, say, 20 years since the Obama administration and the pivot to Asia.
Great. Thank you so much, Jim. Is it possible for me to share slides?
Sure. Let's you just share your screen, and then we go from
Great.
there.
Just give me a minute. I'm always a little clumsy with this.
There we go.
Great. Can you see something that says defense planning guidance?
Yes.
Great. Okay. So this is what you were referring to. This is what's sometimes called the Wolfowitz doctrine. And I think it's very, very appropriate that we start from there, because this really lays out the blueprint for the current state of affairs. Remember, Wolfowitz wrote this in the uh, era of the fall of the Soviet Union. And this is also a period when the US believed that it essentially had achieved the end of history, that, that it was going to be US dominance henceforth, and that there was no alternative. And as you can see here, Wolfowitz says that our first objective is to prevent the reemergence of a new rival, and to take any measures, any action, any means in order to prevent that. So I think that's the key thing that we have to understand. I want to backtrack a little bit to the people who are responsible for this, which is I apologize. I'm having a little bit of problem with my PowerPoint, as is often the case. But
All right. Just maybe put it back on.
yes, hold on one second. Once again, can we see this?
Yes.
Okay, and then I'm going to see if I can move forward with my so the core question is, why is the US escalating to war with China? It really is already at war. We just haven't reached the kinetic stage yet. Uh,
Now, are you trying to change your slide?
Correct, yes.
So, yeah, click on the next slide.
I'm doing that.
There we go.
Yes. Okay. So we have to remember that in 1949, China essentially liberated itself from colonial rule, and it claimed that it had stood up. And when that happened, there was a huge wave of Sinophobia. Essentially, this was the McCarthy era, and the question was, who lost China? As if the United States actually owned China. But this resulted in two hot wars and the Korean War and the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War, if you look at the documents, was really about China and concerns about China. We also saw the counterinsurgency in Malaya, what's sometimes referred to as the Malaya emergency. And then there was also a mass politicide. So you can see already that the stakes around China were extraordinarily high. And you also have to place this inside a larger context in which there has been tremendous anti-China racism for a very, very long time. That somehow that the Chinese are dirty, dishonest, depraved, despotic, dangerous. These are tropes that go back centuries. But during the Nixon era, as you know, the US opened relations with China in order to counterbalance against the USSR. And it was also considered to be a tremendous economic opportunity. Eventually, it was something that benefited both countries. But I want to go to the person who is probably the father of the current situation. He's a man called Andrew Marshall. And people consider him to have been the model for Dr. Strangelove. Daniel Ellsberg says that Dr. Strangelove is not a Hollywood fiction. He says it's a documentary. But Andrew Marshall was the person who is probably one of the fathers of the neocons. And he ran the Office of Net Assessment inside the Pentagon for 42 years. This is the Pentagon's own internal think tank. He was the top advisor to 12 secretaries of defense. And he had two key obsessions. One was US military supremacy against the Soviet Union. And after the fall of the USSR, he wanted to ensure supremacy against China. That is, preventing China's rise to power. And he cultivated a lot of proteges and acolytes. These people are sometimes referred to as the people who worshipped in the Church of St. Andrew, or it's sometimes called St. Andrew's Prep School. But these are people like Wolfowitz, Cheney, Rumsfeld, Cohen, Krapinovich, Pillsbury, Herman Kahn, Richard Pearl, Richard Armitage, etc. I think you recognize some of these people and some of their faces. Of course, one of the key people was Paul Wolfowitz, and he was the person who wrote the Wolfowitz Doctrine. The Wolfowitz Doctrine became the project for a new American century. That's the seminal paper called Rebuilding America's Defenses. And the PNAC project was total world domination, what they referred to as euphemistically unipolar global dominance. That's just a polite word for boss of the world. And they asserted that they would have full spectrum dominance, that is, dominance in every dimension of human existence and planetary existence. And it was unfettered by any notion of international law or morality or rationality. In particular, it argued for aggressive preemptive war, including the use of nuclear and biological warfare. And they said that in order to make this really work, we need a Pearl Harbor type incident. And lo and behold, we had 9/11. And starting even back in this era, they were explicitly mentioning China as a threat. And so you can see this evolution, the Defense Planning Guidance to the Project for a New American Century, which became the Bush Doctrine. And even during the Bush era, some of the neocons, Cheney in particular, Cheney and Rumsfeld, actually wanted to have kinetic war with China. This was headed off by some other people, and also because the Middle East was such an obsession. But we also know that, they went on a rampage throughout the Middle East. The Bush Doctrine was inherited into the Obama Doctrine, which then declared the pivot to Asia. The pivot to Asia was essentially the declaration of encirclement and containment of China. This was in 2011 by Barack Obama, and it came twinned with a formal doctrine of war called air-sea battle, as well as a plan for economic war called the Trans-Pacific Partnership. This then was continued by the Trump doctrine, and it was written into the national security strategy and the national defense strategy and Trump's trade war. And then now this has become the Biden doctrine, the Indo-Pacific doctrine, all these economic sanctions, etc. So it has a long and continuous history. Just going back to the pivot, this was architected by Kurt Campbell, who is now Deputy Secretary of State. And Kurt Campbell, when he was asked about Asia, he said he looked forward to having a magnificent symphony of death. Let me say that again, a magnificent symphony of death in East Asia. This is the man who architected the pivot, and now he's being brought back as the Deputy Secretary of State. So the pivot to Asia was about bringing 60% of the firepower to encircle and contain China. It involved a war doctrine called air-sea battle. Most of you don't know, haven't heard of air-sea battle or its predecessor, air-land battle, but you have probably heard of shock and awe. The colloquial term for air-land battle is shock and awe. Air-sea battle is the Chinese version or the China-directed version of air-land battle. Essentially, it's a doctrine of shock and awe prepared for China. And then you saw the base building and the shaping the environment and the provocations, as well as the building of alliances, allowing Japan to remilitarize, getting Korea involved, creating trilateral alliances, JACUS, AUKUS, JAFUS, etc., JOFUS, and this continuous building up of the capacity for war. Just moving on, Andrew Krapinovich is an important member of this cabal. He actually wrote out the nuts and bolts of war with China. It's called Air-Sea Battle, which is developed from the doctrine of war against the Soviet Union. Air-Land Battle, which was actually developed from the Israeli doctrine of war in the Yom Kippur War. And essentially, it envisages deep, blinding strikes deep into Chinese territory. It's this extension of war in all dimensions, in space and in time. And we get a good sense of what that looks like when we look at what is happening in Gaza. There's also Michael Pillsbury. There's Blue Team, Red Team. These were other people who were very, very much involved in this escalation to war. These are some of the Blue Team members. You might be able to recognize them. John Bolton, Michael Pillsbury, Robert Kagan, etc., Elliot Abrams. It's a kind of a rogues gallery of neocons. The Blue Team got together with Andrew Marshall's proteges, and they essentially developed this neocon agenda, not only for the Middle East, but for the entire planet, and including China. And so they have been doing this for decades now. Nancy Pelosi is actually one of the most important members of the Blue Team, and she has been China bashing since the 1990s. She meets with China bashing members of the Taiwan legislature, very similar to the Israeli lobbying group, almost once every 2 weeks, although she refuses to meet with Code Pink or any peace activists. And essentially, the doctrine of these people is, I think, most well elucidated by Frank Gaffney, who says there is no hope of coexistence with China. He created the Committee on the Present Danger. Currently, inside the US Congress, there is the Committee on the CPC, which is essentially a repurposing of this kind of McCarthyite witch hunting. It's Yellow Peril and Red Scare. Just to give you a little bit of the geopolitical dimension of this, this is an old map of Asia, and it's quite beautiful. And it has a slight resemblance to a topological map of the planet. If you look at this, a topological map shows only the connections between countries, not their sizes, but simply their connections to each other. You can see China has the largest number of connections with any other country. And you can see that the top 2/3 is the Eurasian and African continent. The blue lines are oceans. And you can see all of this connects overland in single unit. And the bottom third is the Americas. And you can see that it's a smaller and more isolated part of the globe. There was an Oxford geographer, Halford Mackinder, in the early 20th century, put forth a theory called the heartland theory. And he said, essentially, the 400, 500 years of colonialism that is held together through the sea-based powers is ending. And essentially, the world or the globe is transitioning to land-based powers. And he predicted that the country that controlled Eurasia, which he referred to specifically as the pivot area, would command the world. He says, who rules Eurasia commands the heartland, who rules the heartland commands the world island, that would be Eurasia and Africa, and who rules the world island commands the world. So already he's thrown down the gauntlet. And then you can see in all the geostrategic thinkers, they understand that they cannot allow Eurasia to unite in opposition to US or Western hegemony. And so this is one of the origins of the Wolfowitz doctrine. That's why they say specifically to prevent any hostile power from dominating a region. Now, the other thing to understand is that China's rise is not a challenge or a domination to the United States. It's simply breaking the mold of subservience that the global South has always had vis-a-vis the Western colonial North. That is to say, for example, from over the past 60 years, $152 trillion or $62 trillion, depending on how you calculate it, has been extracted from the global South, from the poorest countries on the planet towards the richest countries on the planet, simply in the same way that we see the extraction of wealth happening from the working class to the ruling elite inside our own country. You can see that phenomenon as happening also on a global, international scale. Essentially, the ruling elite and the global West lives high on the hog because there is this continual extraction of value from the global South. China has broken that mold because it's managed to become developed and it is breaking out of that control. And that is one of the reasons why the West or the United States sees it as a threat. So going back to this evolution of war on China, there's the Heartland Theory, which becomes a defense planning guidance document, which also is about contemporaneous with Brzezinski's grand chess game, which becomes the project for a new American century. And then that becomes the pivot to Asia, run out of the center for a new American security. This is Kurt Campbell's think tank, and it's essentially a rebranding or a retreading of the project for a new American century. Those two words, new American, are not, they're not a coincidence. It's a kind of a recycling of the PNAG into CNAS. So, so you can see here that China has been surrounded with US bases. The US is constantly shaping the environment for war. Some people have said rather, tongue-in-cheek, how did China put its country so close to our bases? But actually, it's the United States who's very, very clearly surrounding China with military hardware. And there's something called the First Island Chain, which is the entire literal island chain around China, which is being packed full of bases and material and arms and warfighting capacity. Once again, you can see all the bases. It literally is, it's a very, very crowded dance floor, and, a single mishap could result in, very serious, consequences. You can see that, again, it's a complete, almost total encirclement. You can see the first island chain and the second island chain, and there's also a third island chain. Air-sea battle is the doctrine of war against China, released sometime around 2011 to the public, but it was started in 2009. And it derives from air-land battle, which was the NATO doctrine of war against the Soviet Union. And as I said, it's all about deep battle extended in time and space. It's a kind of joint operations, multi-domain integrated battle. It was a lot applied in Gulf War I, and we referred to it back then as shock and awe. It was also applied in Kosovo, in the Balkans. It was applied in the Middle East. And then it was adapted for China as air-sea battle, and they call it a point of departure operational concept. Now, if you read Pentagon documents, operational concept is a euphemism for plan of war. And there's also other documents that have been drafted by RAND, the think tank, which is about how to wage war with China. One of the things that they want is they calculate that if they have a war in the South China Sea, this will choke off China's oil supply and disrupt its trade. Most of the trade going through the South China Sea, which the US purports to be trying to keep freedom of navigation open, is going to China. It's either going to China or leaving from China. So there's no reason why China would impede any of that trade. But the US calculation, according to RAND, this was commissioned by the Pentagon, is that if there was a shooting war in the South China Sea, it would disrupt $5+ trillion worth of China's external trade, and it would block off 77% of China's oil imports. In other words, the US doesn't have to win a shooting war, it just has to have some kind of war happen, and that would result in massive damage to China's economy, probably reduce its economy about 30%, which would possibly result in the collapse of China. So all of this has been very deeply war gamed out. And this RAND document was written almost 10 years ago. And in the RAND document, they said that war needs to happen by 2025. Otherwise, China gets too, big and powerful, and therefore our chances of winning become less. And so then what we hear in the US, is that China is going to wage war, and it's going to go to war in 2025. This is called the Minahan window. And then there's also another window which says that they'll go to war in 2027. But all of these are really projections. The accusation is really a confession. It's really the United States, which is very, very much in favor and in a hurry to go to war. It knows that its power is diminishing, its power to influence and to coerce and to cajole and to bully the world is diminishing. And I think it sees that it still has military supremacy, and it would rather go to war sooner rather than later. Bob has just asked, does the US expect China to follow the USSR into oblivion? And that was originally part of the calculation. The calculation was that initially when they engaged with China, is that they would be able to, quote unquote, liberalize China and then eventually balkanize it the way that they had planned or that they had conducted with the Soviet Union, that they could do a Soviet Union 2 on China as well. That didn't work out so well because in 2008, instead of China collapsing, the Western financial structure collapsed, and they actually needed to ask for China's help to be bailed out of this death spiral. And so when that became clear that China was not going to collapse of its own accord, then the daggers came out. And this is when air-sea battle started to be prepared and when Obama prepared the pivot to Asia. So all of these are really, really good questions. I apologize. I'm missing some of the comments in the chat, but I'll try and address them later. So anyway, China has a response, and there's this continual escalation of war. You can see this in the South China Sea. You can see the way that other countries are being pulled into it. I won't go into all of the issues around the South China Sea, but I do want to point out that one of the ways China has responded is by creating overland routes. And again, where these overland routes that bypass the South China Sea, you also see that they've been tremendously destabilized. For example, Myanmar is currently in a full-scale civil war, and Pakistan recently had its leader overthrown, and Iran and even Lebanon had a huge explosion on the port. So everywhere where China is trying to build out connections with other countries, you see that there's disturbance, and a lot of this disturbance can be traced back to US influence. Sometimes I say that the US is playing chess, which is to say that it's occupying space in order to kill. And China is playing Go. And anybody who knows the game of Go it's essentially a game where you connect to live. So China is connecting to live, and it's connecting almost all of the global South under the infrastructural program of the Belt and Road, which is an extraordinary benefit to the world. CSIS, one of the US think tanks, has said that they hate the Belt and Road because it is such a good idea. And this contradicts everything that they were saying before, that it was some kind of, nefarious debt trap. They say it's a positive, inspirational program, and that the US needs to compete against it because it has nothing that can compete against it. And they hate it because it's such a positive and beneficial project for the global South. But so anyway, Taiwan is also a key issue. You can see very clearly that the US is shaping the environment for war, and it is provoking. The US passed the legislation called the Taiwan Enhanced Resilience Act, which is essentially a declaration of war against China. Taiwan is part of China. This is recognized in Taiwan's own constitution. It's recognized by the United Nations. It's recognized by the US State Department. You can go into the US State Department and see that they recognize Taiwan as a province of China because it is part of the One China policy. And that has never, ever changed. But at the same time, the US is arming it to the teeth and trying to turn it into a second Ukraine. And just to understand this, if I give you a shoe on the other foot analogy, you can think of any part of the United States which has secessionist tendencies, Guam, Hawaii, California, Texas. Can you imagine if China were giving arms and money to Texas so that it could declare independence, and that they were sending trainers, and that they were also stationing PLA, Chinese troops, on Texas? Would that be acceptable? I don't think so. I think the US would understand it, rightly so, as a declaration of war. And this is currently what the US is doing right now on Taiwan Island. The Jinmen Island is 3 kilometers from China. They've stationed Green Berets on it. It's literally swimming distance. And there are US troops on Jinmen Island within visual sight of Xiamen, the Chinese city on the mainland. So that's the view from Jinmen Island to Xiamen City. This is where the US currently has Green Berets stationed. So I think that's enough for now. I could go a little bit more into, the strategic dimensions and essentially, but I won't. I think really what we're looking at is we're looking at a very, very dangerous moment where war could go nuclear, and that there is this kind of continual deceit in the media where they're trying to manufacture consent. It's what William Casey said, the CIA director. He said, we'll know our program is complete when everything the American public believes is false. My belief is that, the farther we are away from the truth, the closer we are to war. Those who tell you absurdities are preparing you for atrocities, as we see right now happening in Gaza, when people tell us that this live stream genocide that is happening before our eyes is not happening. And likewise, they tell us absurd lies about China in the hope that they might be able to trick us into believing that war with China is justified. So anyway, I think I'll stop there, and maybe we can have a short discussion. I'm moving around a little bit. I apologize.
That's all right. Thank you, KJ. Thank you. We'll have you back again, and you can go into more detail on some of the strategic issues. Let me just raise some of the questions that have been put into the chat. The first by Shannon MacArthur, just reminding everyone of the extraordinary amount of US debt held by China, some $859.4 billion in US debt. I mean, China made headlines the other day saying they were offloading about 74 billion of that into the debt market. But it's not only the case that the United States is doing things to China. China, at the active encouragement of the United States, has a huge amount of our debt, which gives them leverage that the US, I don't think, is fully calculated for. Do you want to comment on that?
Yes, I think, the issue of debt is something that really needs to be thought through carefully. And the reason why I say that is that how was this debt accrued towards China? Essentially, it happened through trade. That is, China was exporting goods to us, and then the United States would pay China back with paper. The US gets to print as much paper as it wants to. So these would usually be dollars, or more specifically, treasuries denominated in dollars. So there is hundreds of billions of dollars every year that the US incurs in a trade deficit. And instead of catching up with its debt, the the US simply uses its credit card over and over again. This is the printing press that the US has the right to print dollars. Now, why does the US get to print dollars at will? This is called this exorbitant privilege of having the reserve currency. Why does the US have the reserve currency? Well, this ties back to Israel and Saudi Arabia and the petrodollar. That is to say, in 1971, the US went off the gold standard and they made an arrangement with the Gulf states, in particular Saudi Arabia, to price oil, which is the most important commodity to power industrial capitalism. They made the agreement with Saudi Arabia to price oil in dollars. Anybody who wanted to buy oil had to acquire dollars in order to acquire oil, in order to keep their economies running. And so this is what we call the petrodollar structure, and it has been the foundation of US power for at least 50 years. And this is where Israel becomes very, very important, because Israel is a key power. It's a key US imperial outpost in the Middle East, and it enforces US dominance in the Middle East among the petrostates, along with the the Gulf states that are aligned or that have been subservient to the United States. So in a sense, the notion that China has acquired this huge debt, that it controls US debt, is a little bit of a misnomer, because when you have a debt that large, it's not that China has power over the United States, it's largely that the US has power over China, right? If you owe $1,000 to the bank, it's your problem. If you owe $10 billion to the bank, it's the bank's problem, right? So
Good point.
It's a different dynamic. And essentially, it boils down to the fact that for decades, the Chinese have been working really, really hard to acquire wealth by selling useful, productive goods to the United States. And in exchange, the United States has been giving the Chinese essentially worthless paper. They've just been giving them an IOU over and over and over again. And what is happening right now with the BRICS countries, Brazil, the global South countries led by China, is they're trying to break away from this dollar hegemony, because this dollar hegemony gives the US this exorbitant privilege. It essentially gets to live off a credit card for free. It gets to wage war and put the wars on its credit card. And also it allows the US to sanction countries at will and to appropriate their reserves and to wage lawfare against them simply because something somewhere along the way was dollar denominated. So this is creating this huge stimulus for de-dollarization, which is starting to happen. This is what we're starting to see. And once again, that is another piece that makes the US very, very frightened and also very unhappy, because once again, the power, this kind of exorbitant privilege the US has to do with the fact that it owns the global reserve currency that everybody is supposed to be using.
Mm-hmm. Now, Roberto Schifo is asking a different question, and that is, where does Europe fit into all this? Because the Europeans have been taking an increasingly anti-China line along with the United States. What's your understanding of where Europe is in all this?
Well, it's a very interesting moment in history, because Europe has both been allied with the United States, and at a certain point it looked like it might be taking a more independent direction. For example, France during the Gaullist era, and certain rhetorical pronouncements, during, Chirac. Chirac refused to join the Iraq War, and Macron has made some rhetorical pronouncements that make it seem like he's looking for a more independent path. But by and large, the European leadership, which is different from the people of Europe. The European elite leadership seems to be very, very much in bed with the US ruling imperial elite. I'm talking about your Ursula von der Leyen. I'm talking about the EU, unelected EU leadership, which seems very, very much in alignment with the United States in its escalation, both to war against China and also war against Russia. And I think what that speaks to is that the world is going back not simply to Cold War divisions, but to colonial era divisions. That is, the Western European colonial countries are realigning with themselves. And you see a counter bloc or a counter hegemonic bloc arising in the global south, led by Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, etc. So we see the world kind of shifting back into a much older paradigm of colonizer and colonized, and the colonized are rising up against that, which once again, just forces or makes the Western European imperial elite, even more desperate to hold on to their power.
Yes, and as I was saying in my opening remarks, the difference between now and 30 years ago is 30 years ago, the colonizers had technical, economic, and I would say strategic superiority and a very ideological advantage over the global south. And now the situation is reversed. The global south has a technical parity, military parity, and an ideology that is now increasingly popular. So as we return to the old is really new in the sense that this is the first time in 500 years where the colonized are not only starting to group themselves together, but are doing so with a technical, economic, and military capacity that can really stand up to the West, as Russia is doing in Ukraine. It is defeating the Ukrainians. And as China is doing in Asia, as it's holding its own against US pressure. So it's an old ball game, but it's a new ball game as well.
Absolutely, yes, it really is. It's the old world having to reconcile with the karma that it has inflicted on the rest of the global south, and we see really a movement of the non-aligned south
Yes.
reinvigorated to seek a true decolonization. I think that's the process that's going on right now. And the other thing that's very important to notice is what we see in the global south are what I refer to as sovereign socialist projects. These are actually existing socialist projects, such as you can see in China, which has a mixed hybrid project, which is state-led and planned. And then you see, Venezuela, Nicaragua, Cuba, etc. And over and over and over again, in the global south, you have seen projects that have been communitarian, socialist, popular, people-oriented. And for the past 70 years, they have all been put down with extreme violence, subversion, often genocide by the ruling Western imperial elite. And that, I think, is now, that stranglehold is breaking. And so you see breathing space for these sovereign socialisms to arise in the global south. And I believe that is a very, very positive development, that as we see, 100 flowers blossom, perhaps some of those lessons and insights can trickle back to us in the imperial core, and that we don't need to hold on to this dominator model of the planet where it's always power over, and that we have to be in control and dominating and suppressing and repressing the rest of the planet in order to extract them, but that we can live together in community, in a global community that seeks win-win and mutual cooperation and mutual development for everybody. I think that's part of the lesson that China is trying to impart to the global south. And I think it's part of the historical trend that the United States and the West could also join if it were not so tightly and extraordinarily controlled by its ruling imperial elite and the mass indoctrination that it enforces on its population.
Well, let's dwell on this for a moment, because there's been a number of questions, and I think this is a good place to bring them in as we bring this conversation to a close. And that is, given the complexities, KJ, and you know them better than most, what steps could be taken to begin a rapprochement that, in your view, would be politically realistic? I mean, we have both Biden and Trump, I would say virulently anti-Chinese, and I don't know how one would distinguish the one from the other. Maybe you could help us understand some of the nuances there. But if you were advising the president or Europe how to get out of this mess, which seems to be leading to a real conflagration in the next, say, 18 to 24 months, if you believe some of the U.S. generals and some of the commentators, et cetera, what would be your plan of action? What would be your recommendations in terms of concrete steps?
I think the most concrete step is simply to stop the war machine, stop the death machine. We can see that we really are on a death march towards world war. And I'm not exaggerating here. Just earlier today, a few hours ago, I was reading that the United States was preparing plans to use tactical nukes, fire them from submarines, in the waters around China. That is to adapt submarines so that they can fire tactical nukes, tomahawks from U.S. submarines. And the U.S. legislature was saying, well, this will put China on notice because they won't know if we are firing conventional missiles or tactical nukes. That's the wrong framing. The problem is China won't know if you're firing tactical nukes or strategic nukes. And if there is a doubt about that, China doesn't have a launch on warning policy. It detaches its warheads from their delivery vehicles because it does not believe in preemptive nuclear strikes. It doesn't believe in nuclear war, period. But it certainly doesn't believe in preemptive nuclear strikes, and it doesn't believe in reactive nuclear actions. But by taking away all strategic depth, giving them no reaction time, and by creating this ambiguity about whether they're going to strike China with strategic nuclear weapons, you essentially force China into a launch on warning mode. And that essentially means that the world could go up in a nuclear conflagration. But the ruling imperial elite seem to believe that that is a risk worth taking. And in fact, they seem to think that it is better to risk the end of the planet than to risk the end of their supremacy and their hegemony. They would rather see the end of the world than the end of their supremacy. And this is why this moment is so dangerous. This has been enumerated by some of their key thinkers. Reinhold Niebuhr, the theologian, essentially said the same thing, 70 years ago. He said better dead than red, right? This was regarding the Soviet Union. But this mindset, this thinking is still inherited to this day. And I'm seeing a little bit in the comments, and once again, I apologize not for responding to them fully, but people are saying things like, what about China's social credit system? Okay, well, I'm not Chinese, but I am a journalist who has studied China objectively and carefully for a very, very long time. And let me just state it for the record. There is no social credit system in China. There are small regional systems that track people's credit score, which is not that different from what the US does with your credit score. We all have a credit score, whether it's good or bad, and that affects us, our ability to do certain types of financial things. But it is no more, and I would argue it's probably less invasive than a US credit score. And so this person seems to be saying that perhaps, I don't want to put words in their mouth, but they seem to be saying China is bad, and therefore anything we do to China is okay. I don't know if that's their statement, but often that's the tenor of statements that I hear from people. And once again, I want to point out how ridiculous it is. You know, what China does inside its own borders is China's business. It is not the right of the United States to interfere in China's governance, just as it's not China's job to interfere in the governance of the United States. States are sovereign. But more than that, I don't think it's justifiable to go to war and to risk the end of the planet simply because you don't like some mythical idea of China's social credit system, which may or may not exist. So we really have to let go of this missionary ideology that gives the United States the right to interfere in other countries' affairs. It has no right to interfere in Taiwan, which is its internal region. It has no right to interfere in China's whatever economic system, whatever it does. And let me assure that person that China is not a repressive state. You go to China, and somewhere in the range of 95% of the population are satisfied with the central government. This is a study by Harvard University over 15 years. It's not Chinese propaganda. This is what Harvard University has found out. So the Chinese are very, very satisfied with their government because it's a government that delivers. And the notion that the Chinese believe that a governmental system requires legitimacy through its performance. It has to deliver the goods. It's not some kind of formal system of, having, votes once every 4 years. They believe that legitimacy comes from performing, that is actually delivering the goods for its people. And 95% of the Chinese say they are satisfied with their leadership, and close to 80% say that they are a democracy. And I think those statistics, I think are very telling, and we certainly don't see anything like that in the United States or anywhere in the global North.
Yes. I'd love to have you back sometime, maybe with some others, just to talk about the realities of China behind the barrage of negative stereotyping and propaganda, because it's as different in its reality as many other countries are. When you actually go there, you find that all the stereotypes in your mind fall away with a reality that's much more complex, exuberant, and inviting than you would have ever imagined. So I'd like to have you back on that. And let me just ask a further question about your recommendations as to exact steps. Let China alone, stop meddling with Taiwan. What else would you recommend as a practical policy matter that could bring us away, get the United States to pull back from the brink of yet another war?
They say personnel is policy. If I were advising the president, I would say fire the 18 top officials from the Center for New American Security that are driving this country to war with China. They've already messed up on Afghanistan. CNAS, Center for New American Security, is responsible for the debacle in Afghanistan and Iraq. And they're also responsible for the debacle in the Ukraine, as well as in in Gaza, and now they want, two wars. A war and a genocide is not enough. They want a third war, a world war against a peer competitor. That's not acceptable. So you really need to purge Washington of the neocons from Center for New American Security. I'm talking about almost everybody in his top cabinet is from CNAS. And then I think the other thing that we have to do as an informed public is not to be deceived by the lies. I've always said that before the United States goes to war, it wages information war. Information war is the pre-kinetic dimension of war. Before the bombs drop, the narratives are launched. The lies are constantly, we're bombarded with lies. And this is because the United States sees mental space as a battle domain. That is, space is a battle domain, cyberspace is a battle domain, but mental space, your mind itself, they see as a domain of battle. And what they try to do as they go to war is they try and silence any critical voice, any voice for peace. It's like when you go in, before the infantry goes in, you send in air power and you create a no-fly zone. What they want to do is they want to create a no-think zone, a no critical thinking zone amongst the American population, so that they kind of accept the lies that they are bombarded with, that you create this consent, this manufacture, this consent for war. And then there is going to be no more critical thinking, no objections to war, no objections to genocide, no objections to escalation to even greater war with China. This is the war, if you will, the information war that is being waged right now. And so what we have to do as individuals is we have to decolonize and deoccupy our minds from the lies that we're being constantly fed from the mainstream media and the ruling imperial elite. We have to just kind of abandon and really discard these lies. So, when people say silly things like, what about Tibet? What about social credit? What about Uyghurs, etc.? This is just part of the barrage of lies. And I invite people to think critically and not to accept anything as given by what they're being fed by the ruling imperial elite and the mainstream media. It's a very interesting phenomenon because people tend to distrust what they're being told by the government about almost any issue. But they seem to believe, hook, line, and sinker, the lies they're being told about China from the government. And I think that's, that there's something really, really important to unpack there. But, my general suggestion is that don't let your mind be occupied. Do not let your mind become part of the theater of war for this escalation, which could result in the end of the planet. We really need to think critically and to fight back and to reclaim our own capacity to think independently and critically.
KJ, thank you so much. I think we'll bring it to a close on that. Very important note, everyone, that we have to question what we're being told and to look for a deeper reality. And it's that deeper reality that liberates us from the danger of moving as we are right now into a war in Asia like we have in Europe and the Middle East. So thank you, KJ, very, very much for that. KJ will join the after chat for a little bit. And so we'll bring this session to a close. You'll see the link in the chat box, and you received it in your Zoom reminder for today for the after chat. And then tomorrow, we're going to go to another domain and a parallel universe. We're going to go back with Hope Fitzgerald and look at the mysteries and miracle of communications with water. As Humanity Rising, we take it all on, everyone. And today we delved into China, but KJ, we're going to have you back to further illuminate us. And I think the next time we want to focus on the realities of China itself, because I think, as we've seen in the chat, there's a lot of contrary opinions and a lot of confusions, and I think you and others could bring some real light to that. So thanks so much, and I'll be in touch. Thank you, everyone. That'll do it for us for today. See you tomorrow on Humanity Rising. Bye for now.